August 21, 1976. Inside the Korean demilitarized zone, a convoy moves toward a single poplar tree. The men at the front carry chainsaws. Behind them is enough military power to make the mission look absurd. American and South Korean troops are on combat alert. Cobra attack helicopters are nearby. Fighter aircraft are in the air. B-52 bombers are flying over Korea. The aircraft carrier USS Midway and its escorts are positioned off the coast. And all of it is there for one job: cut down one tree. 3 days earlier, that same tree had been the center of a 4-minute attack that killed 2 American Army officers. Now Washington had a problem. It needed to answer North Korea without starting another Korean War. The solution became one of the strangest shows of force of the Cold War. The place was Panmunjom, inside the Joint Security Area, or JSA. Unlike most of the demilitarized zone, this was a small area where United Nations command personnel and North Korean troops worked almost face-to-face. The Korean War had stopped with an armistice in 1953, not a peace treaty. More than 2 decades later, the border was still dangerous, and the JSA was one of the few places where soldiers from both sides could encounter each other at extremely close range. Near the Bridge of No Return stood a large poplar tree. It was not important because of what it was. It was important because of where it stood. Its branches blocked the line of sight between United Nations command positions. One checkpoint was especially exposed, and the tree made it harder for another post to watch what was happening there. So the solution seemed routine. Trim the branches. On August 18th, a work party entered the area. Captain Arthur Bonifas, the commander of the JSA Security Company, led the detail. He was a Vietnam veteran and, according to a later Army history, had only a few days left before leaving the DMZ. First Lieutenant Mark Barrett went with him. South Korean workers brought the tools. A small security detail accompanied them. At first, nothing suggested that this maintenance job would become an international crisis. The workers began cutting branches. About 10 minutes later, a group of North Korean soldiers arrived. They watched the work. Then more North Korean troops appeared. According to an Army account, roughly 30 North Korean guards were eventually at the scene. Some carried clubs and metal pipes. A North Korean officer ordered the work stopped. The trimming continued. Then the situation changed in seconds. North Korean soldiers attacked the work party. Bonifas was struck down. Barrett tried to escape toward a nearby depression in the ground. The South Korean workers scattered, leaving tools behind. Those tools were picked up and used during the assault. The entire attack lasted only about 4 minutes. By the time the JSA reaction force reached the scene, the fighting was effectively over. Bonifas and Barrett were dead. Other American and South Korean personnel were injured. A routine maintenance detail had just produced 2 American deaths at one of the most politically sensitive borders on Earth. And now the United States had to decide what 2 dead officers were going to mean. Within hours, the argument moved from Panmunjom to Washington. President Gerald Ford wanted a strong response. Henry Kissinger and senior military and diplomatic officials met in the White House Situation Room. Their problem was larger than the tree. If the United States did nothing, it risked making American forces at the DMZ look vulnerable. If it reacted too aggressively, a local incident could become a war involving hundreds of thousands of troops on the Korean peninsula. The options discussed were not symbolic. Officials considered raising the military alert. They discussed moving additional combat aircraft into Korea. They considered a carrier task group. They discussed B-52 flights. Other ideas ranged from seizing a North Korean vessel to military attacks against North Korean positions. The first step came quickly. US and South Korean forces in Korea moved to DEFCON 3, a significantly higher state of readiness. American F-4 fighters began deploying. Washington also started building a larger package of visible military pressure. But one idea kept returning to the discussion. Finish the tree job. Not just trim it. Cut it down. This sounds almost comic until you understand what the tree had become. It was no longer landscaping, It had become a test of whether North Korea could kill 2 American officers and then prevent the United Nations command from completing the same task. Kissinger's meetings show how strange the calculation was. Officials worried that sending another small work crew would simply create another confrontation. One participant asked why anyone should risk more people for a tree. But that was exactly why the tree now mattered. Walking away could be read as surrendering the ground. The answer was to make the next work crew almost impossible to challenge. The mission received a name that matched the scale of the response: Operation Paul Bunyan, after the giant lumberjack of American folklore. The plan was simple in purpose and enormous in execution. On the morning of August 21, only 3 days after Bonifas and Barrett were killed, the United Nations command returned to the JSA. This time the engineers were not arriving as an isolated maintenance team. An Army historical account describes an 813-man task force. The regular JSA security force was reinforced. South Korean Special Forces personnel were included. Combat engineers came to do the actual cutting. Helicopters supported the force. Cobra gunships were ready. Artillery and other forces stood behind the operation. Above the peninsula, American air power made the message even clearer. B-52 bombers flew over Korea. F-4 fighters and F-111 aircraft supported the show of force. Off the coast, the USS Midway carrier task force was in position. The United States was not planning to bomb the tree. It was making sure everyone in North Korea understood what could happen if they tried to stop the men with chainsaws. That distinction was the entire strategy. The operation had to look dangerous enough to prevent a fight, while remaining controlled enough not to start one. The North Koreans were given only a short notification before the mission began. Then the engineers went to work. Chainsaws bit into the trunk. American and South Korean troops watched the surrounding positions. North Korean soldiers gathered on their side and watched too. For several minutes, 2 forces that had technically been living under an armistice since 1953 stared at each other across a work site, while strategic bombers flew overhead. The most dangerous part of the mission was not cutting the tree. It was waiting to see whether anyone would try to stop them. Nobody did. The North Korean troops did not attack. The engineers kept cutting. Army accounts differ by a few minutes on the exact duration, but in less than an hour the tree was down. The United Nations command left behind a large stump. Operation Paul Bunyan ended without a shot being fired. That was the visible victory. But the more important story was what had almost happened behind it. Declassified American records show that the tree-cutting operation was only one part of a much larger military response. Washington moved aircraft, raised readiness, shifted the Midway task force, and continued examining contingency plans for possible strikes if the crisis escalated. In other words, the chainsaws were real. So was the possibility of something far more serious. The North Korean response after the operation was noticeably different. U.S. diplomatic records described Pyongyang as having been taken aback by the buildup. Kim Il-sung sent a message that American officials treated as apologetic. North Korean forces had watched the tree cutting without interfering. Then came a change that mattered long after the stump was left behind. The old joint security area had allowed personnel from both sides to move through spaces that created repeated face-to-face confrontations. After the crisis, negotiations moved toward physically separating security personnel along the military demarcation line and removing North Korean guard posts from the southern side. The tree had exposed a basic problem with the way Panmunjom worked. A supposedly shared security area had created a place where a minor argument could turn into a strategic crisis in minutes. The deaths of Bonifas and Barrett forced both sides to confront that reality. There is another reason this story matters. Operation Paul Bunyan is often remembered as an absurd Cold War anecdote. America sent bombers and an aircraft carrier to cut down a tree. That description is true, but it misses the point. The bombers were not there because the tree was valuable. They were there because the United States wanted the tree to become the last thing anyone fought over that morning. Washington needed to show that it would return, finish the mission, and defend the men doing it. But it also needed to leave North Korea a way to stand back without immediately being attacked. That is what made the operation dangerous. And that is what made it work. The strongest military action was the one designed so the other side would decide not to act at all. 3 days earlier, a work party had entered the JSA, expecting to trim branches. Now hundreds of soldiers, combat aircraft, helicopters, artillery,